The morning Eliza Calloway arrived in Dustcreek, Texas, the sky was the color of a bruise, and the only man who came to meet her stage was the one she was supposed to marry. She had not expected much. The letter from the matrimonial agency in Philadelphia had been practical to the point of brutality, written in a hand that pressed so hard against the paper it left grooves in the back of the page. The man's name was Cole Harding, 29 years old, owner of a cattle ranch 12 miles south of Dustcreek. He was described as hardworking, steady, and possessed of good moral character. There was no mention of tenderness, no mention of charm. And when Eliza, 22 years old and recently made an orphan by a fever that had cleared out half of the neighborhood she had grown up in, had read those words, she had told herself that steady was enough. Steady was more than enough. She had told herself that all the way from Philadelphia to St. Louis, and from St. Louis to Abilene, and from Abilene south to Dustcreek, across land that grew wilder and more enormous with every mile, until she felt herself shrinking inside her wool traveling dress, becoming small as a pin. Cole Harding was leaning against the post outside the stage office with his arms folded when the coach pulled in. He was taller than she had imagined from his letter, broader through the shoulders, with dark hair pushed back beneath a well-worn hat and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same limestone that made up the bluffs on the edge of town. He was not unhandsome. He was also not smiling. He watched her step down from the coach, and she watched him watching her, and for a long, uncomfortable moment neither of them spoke. "Miss Calloway," he said at last. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that was not accustomed to being raised and did not see the need. "Mr. Harding," she said. He took her 2 bags from the driver without being asked and set them beside his wagon. He offered her a hand up to the seat and she took it, and his grip was warm and dry and careful. He did not let go until she was settled. They drove 12 miles in mostly silence. The land spread out around them in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the grass bent flat by a wind that smelled of dust and something green underneath. Once, a group of pronghorn antelope scattered from the roadside and she startled, and Cole glanced at her sideways but said nothing. It was when the ranch house appeared at the end of a long dirt track, modest and square and surrounded by scrubby trees, that he finally spoke again. "It is not much to look at," he said. "It is standing," she said. "That is something." The corner of his mouth moved, almost imperceptibly, in something that might have been a smile. The wedding took place 3 days later in the parlor of the town reverend, with the reverend's wife and a ranch hand named Amos serving as witnesses. Eliza wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was a blue-gray that matched the October sky outside the window. Cole wore a clean shirt and his second-best hat, and he held her hand when the reverend asked him to, and repeated the words when the reverend prompted him, his voice steady as bedrock. Afterward, in the wagon on the way back to the ranch, he said, "I want you to know that I intend to be a fair man to you, Miss Calloway. I know this is not what either of us might have chosen given different circumstances. But the ranch needs a woman who can manage the house and the accounts, and you needed a place to land. I think we can make something workable of it." Eliza looked at her gloved hands in her lap. A fair man. Something workable. She was 22 years old and she had just married a stranger, and the most romantic thing said to her was that she had needed a place to land. "I am sure you are right," she said, "and please do call me Eliza." "Cole," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her then quickly, as though trying to read something in her face, but she was looking at the road. He showed her the ranch that evening with the efficiency of a man accustomed to giving instructions. The kitchen, the pantry, the cellar, the 2 bedrooms, the fact that he had moved his things to the smaller one so she could have the larger, the ledger books, the accounts. He explained the seasonal rhythms of the cattle work, when the hands would be at the house and when they would be in the far pastures, what she would need to keep stocked in the kitchen during roundup season. He was thorough, and he was courteous, and he was completely without any warmth that was not practical. That night, Eliza sat on the edge of the large bed in the large bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the cattle shifting in the distance, the creak of the house in the wind, and she thought about the life she had left. Her mother's kitchen in Philadelphia, the smell of bread, the sound of the street outside the window, familiar enough to be a kind of music. She pressed her hand flat against the quilt beneath her and breathed in and breathed out and told herself that she was not sad. She was practical. She had made a practical decision and she would live a practical life, and that was perfectly fine. She did not cry, but it was a close thing. The first week was careful and polite, and exhausting in the way that constant politeness always is. Cole rose before dawn every morning, was out the door before she was properly awake, and returned at dusk worn through to the bone, washing up at the basin outside the kitchen door before sitting down to whatever she had managed to put together from the supplies in the pantry. He ate whatever she made without complaint, thanked her each time, and asked her small, careful questions: how she was finding the weather, whether she needed anything from town, whether the range stove was giving her trouble. She answered him in kind, small, careful answers. Yes, the weather was very different. No, she had everything she needed for now. The stove was perfectly manageable, thank you. It was on the 8th day that things shifted, and it happened because of a pie. She had found a bag of dried apples in the back of the pantry and a crock of honey, and she had spent most of the afternoon making a pie, partly because she needed something to do with her hands, and partly because she was homesick in a way that only baking could touch, following the recipe her mother had taught her until the smell of it filled every corner of the house. She set it on the table when Cole came in that evening, and she saw something cross his face, fast and unguarded, before he put it away. "Apple," he said. "Dried, I am afraid," she said. "Not fresh, but I thought it might be a welcome change from the same supper." He sat down and she served him a slice, and she watched him take the first bite, and the look on his face in that moment was the most honest thing she had seen from him yet. His eyes closed briefly, and something in his shoulders dropped that she had not even realized he was holding up. "My mother used to make apple pie," he said. She had not known that. She had not known anything about his mother, she realized. She had not known anything about him except what was written in 2 careful pages forwarded through a matrimonial agency. "Is she gone?" Eliza asked carefully. "3 years ago," he said. He took another bite and did not look at her. "The pie is very good." "Thank you," she said. There was a silence, but it was different from the silences before, less like a wall and more like a door with a hand reaching for the knob. "Tell me something about Philadelphia," he said, and she was so surprised she almost dropped her fork. She told him about the street market near her mother's house that operated every Saturday, the fishmongers and the fruit sellers, and the man who sold nothing but buttons in 17 colors. She told him about the noise and the smell, and the way the cobblestones caught the rain. She told him about her father's bookshop, which had smelled of old paper and pipe smoke, and the way she had read every book in it twice by the time she was 15. He listened. He actually listened, not in the polite way of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but in the real way, his eyes on her face, his fork set down. "What made you decide to come west?" he asked. The question was more honest than any he had asked before, and it deserved an honest answer. "There was nothing left," she said. "My mother in February and my father in March, both of them the fever. The shop was rented, not owned. I had my aunt in Albany, but she had 8 children of her own and no room and no patience for another. The agency was in the newspaper. I thought, I have skills and I have sense, and I would rather make something new than spend my life apologizing for needing a place at someone else's table." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That took some courage," he said. "Or desperation," she said. "I have not decided which." The corner of his mouth moved again in that almost smile. "Sometimes they are the same thing," he said. And that was the night that the careful politeness between them began, very slowly, to become something else. It did not happen all at once. Nothing in that landscape happened all at once. The land itself taught her that. the way the seasons turned so gradually that you could not name the exact day summer became autumn, only look around one morning and find that everything had changed. She learned his rhythms. He was up before the light always. He drank his coffee black and strong and standing up, looking out the kitchen window at the dark yard as though he was memorizing it. He did not speak much in the mornings, not out of rudeness, but out of a kind of focused quiet, the way a man organizes himself before going into the weather. She learned not to press conversation on him then, to simply have the coffee ready and let him stand with it in peace. In the evenings was different. In the evenings after supper there was a slowing down to him, a loosening, and he would sit at the table or on the porch steps and talk, not about the ranch but about other things. He had opinions about everything, quietly held, deeply felt, about the land and what it owed men and what men owed it, about the railroad and what it was doing to the cattle trails, about books, which surprised her deeply on the third week when she found a shelf of them in the back bedroom, properly read, their spines cracked. "You read Twain," she said, holding up the battered copy. "I have read everything on that shelf twice," he said, not as a boast but as a plain fact. She had laughed at that, really laughed, because it was so close to what she had said about her father's bookshop that she felt a sudden ridiculous sense of recognition, like finding a word in a foreign language that sounded exactly like one from home. Cole looked at her laugh with an expression she could not quite read. Intent, maybe. Like he was committing it to memory. Eliza was not naive. She knew what she had agreed to when she stepped off that stage. She knew the shape of the arrangement. Two people agreeing to be useful to one another, nothing more. She had told herself clearly and sensibly that love was for the fortunate, and she was a practical woman and practicality would serve her well enough. But Cole Harding kept confounding practicality. The second month, in the deep cold of November, the windmill that fed the water trough froze and then broke, and Cole spent 2 days in freezing wind wrestling it back into working order. He came inside the second evening barely able to close his hands, his lips faintly blue, and she had pulled his hands between hers without thinking and rubbed warmth back into them, bent over them with her breath, and when she looked up he was looking at her with an expression so naked and undefended that she felt her stomach turn over. Neither of them spoke. She finished warming his hands. He thanked her quietly and went to put on dry clothes. But that night at supper, he reached across the table and put his hand briefly over hers where it lay on the tablecloth, just for a moment, just a warm weight, and then removed it, and they went on eating as though nothing had happened. But something had happened. She felt it in the air between them for the rest of the evening, altered, charged, like the sky before rain. In December, a man named Rourke came to the ranch. He was a cattle buyer from San Antonio, prosperous and loud, with expensive boots and a way of looking at things as though calculating their price. Cole welcomed him with the civil wariness he extended to most strangers, and Eliza served supper for 3 and mostly listened. Rourke looked at her across the table the way that some men looked at things they considered acquisitions, and it made her want to move her chair back. When he complimented her cooking, the compliment was aimed not at her but at Cole, as if to commend him on his purchase. After supper, when Eliza had gone to the kitchen to clean up, she could hear Rourke through the thin wall. "You did well for yourself there," Rourke said. "A mail-order bride who can cook, practical solution to a practical problem." There was a pause. Cole's voice, when it came, was quieter than usual and carried an edge like the flat of a blade. "My wife's name is Eliza," he said, "and I would thank you to refer to her as such." Another pause. "Of course," Rourke said, with the tone of a man who had touched an electric fence and was pretending he had not. Eliza stood in the kitchen with a dish in her hands and felt something warm move through her chest, slow and spreading as honey from a spoon. She did not say anything about it to Cole, but that night when she passed him in the hallway she stopped and said very quietly, "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment. "There is nothing to thank me for," he said. "It is simply the truth of the matter." He went to his room. She went to hers. She lay in the dark for a long time, thinking about the truth of the matter and what it might mean. Winter deepened and the ranch contracted into itself. The hands fewer, the days shorter, the two of them thrown together by the weather in the warm space of the house. She read to him sometimes in the evenings, and he listened with his head tipped back and his eyes half closed, and she had no way of knowing if he was asleep or simply listening until she paused and he said, "Do not stop," and she did not. He started teaching her to ride in January, because she had mentioned once that she had only ever been on a horse for a cousin's Sunday pleasure ride in Philadelphia, and that was not riding, that was being transported. He took her out most mornings when the weather allowed, patient and precise in his instruction, correcting her seat and her hands without ever making her feel foolish. She was not a natural rider. She held on too tight and sat too stiff, and the horse she was practicing on, a gentle bay mare named Clover, seemed to be as aware of this as Cole was. But Cole did not laugh and he did not grow impatient, and one morning in late January, she finally got it. Something released in her spine, some deep and ridiculous tension, and she moved with the mare instead of against her, and the feeling of it was extraordinary, like discovering a new way to breathe. "There it is," Cole said from the fence where he was watching. She turned to look at him, breathless, and found him smiling. Not the corner of his mouth suggestion of a smile she had been cataloging for months, but an actual, full, unguarded smile, and the force of it hit her like stepping into sunlight from a cold room. She thought, standing there on Clover in the pale January morning, that she was in a very great deal of trouble. She did not say so. She was a practical woman. February brought two things. A letter from her aunt in Albany that was full of charitable concern and barely concealed pity, asking whether Eliza had made a terrible mistake. And a late winter storm that swept down from the north, burying the ranch in 1.5 feet of snow and ice that killed 3 cattle in the far pasture and kept them snowbound for 6 days. Eliza wrote back to her aunt that she had not made a terrible mistake and she was fine. She felt, as she wrote it, that it was the truest thing she had put to paper in some time. The snowbound days were something else entirely. With nowhere to be and nothing that could be done about the drifts, Cole sat at the kitchen table across from her for hours at a time, and they played cards, which he was annoyingly good at, and they talked, which was something that by February had become natural enough between them that the silences, when they came, were comfortable rather than careful. He told her about growing up on this land, his father's ranch before it became his, the drought year when he was 12 that killed half the herd and they had eaten beans and corn for 6 months. He told her about the cattle drives he had been on before his father died and left him the ranch to manage, the months on the trail, the strange stars. He told her about the loneliness of running a place alone, in a way that was not complaint and not a request for sympathy, but simply the stating of a fact, the same way he stated any other. She told him about watching her father die. She had not told anyone the full shape of it, not even her aunt, but she told Cole, the way it had been quick and not quick at the same time, the way her father had looked at her in the last hours and said, "You are the best thing we ever did, your mother and I," and the way she had held that sentence ever since like a coal in her hands, keeping herself warm. Cole was quiet for a long time after she said that. Then he said, he was right. She looked at him across the table. The snow was pressed against the window and the lamp was low and his face was very serious. "You do not know me well enough to say that," she said. "I know you better than you think," he said. She pressed her lips together because something in her throat was misbehaving. "Cole," she said. "Eliza," he said. And that was all that was said, but it was a great deal. Spring came, and with it mud and new calves and the hands returning to full work and 1,000 small crises that kept Cole in perpetual motion from before dawn to past dusk. Eliza found her footing in the rhythm of the ranch. The account she managed with a precision that surprised Cole enough to comment on it. The kitchen that she had made properly her own over the winter. The kitchen garden she began planning and laying out as soon as the ground was soft enough. She planted it herself, mostly. Cole helped when he could, which was not often, but one Saturday afternoon he came and dug the beds with her, working beside her in the warm spring sun, their shoulders close, and at one point she reached for the same fence post he was reaching for, and their hands met and they both went still. Cole looked at their hands. Then he looked at her. She had not planned to say anything. It was not a practical thing to say. But she had been thinking about it for months, turning it over, examining it from every angle the way you examine a stone you have picked up from a riverbed, wondering what it is made of. "Cole," she said, "do you think what we have between us is only practical?" He was very still for a moment. He turned their joined hands over slowly as though he was studying the fact of them. "No," he said, "I stopped thinking that some time ago." "When?" she asked, because she could not help it. He thought about it seriously as he thought about everything. "The pie," he said at last. "The first pie. I think that was when I knew it was going to be something I was not going to be able to keep orderly." She laughed, and this time he laughed with her, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, all the way through, and it was a wonderful sound. He pulled her hand up and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, right there in the mud and the garden, formal as a prayer. She felt it in her bones. "I should have been more honest from the start," he said. "I told you it would be simple, a simple arrangement." "Yes," she said, "you did say that." "I was wrong," he said. "It has not been simple at all. You are the furthest thing from simple, Eliza Harding, and I find that I am entirely grateful for it." She stepped forward and put her free hand on his chest, over his heart, and felt it beating fast and slightly irregular, which seemed entirely appropriate. "I find that I am grateful too," she said. He kissed her there among the turned earth and the garden stakes, and it was nothing like practical and everything like necessary. And she thought that she had not known, in Philadelphia, in her grief and her desperation, that the stage she climbed onto was taking her toward this man and this land and this life. She could not have known. But standing in the spring mud with his arms around her, she thought that perhaps grief and desperation were sometimes the things that carried you, roughly and without ceremony, to exactly where you were meant to be. The town of Dustcreek was small enough that word got around, as words do in small places, faster than a telegram and considerably more distorted. The Harding marriage, which had been considered a practical arrangement by those who knew Cole's habit of practicality, was apparently causing something of a sensation. Eliza became aware of this gradually, through the medium of Mrs. Pierce, the wife of the general store owner, who had a comprehensive knowledge of everyone's business and no particular shame about sharing it. Mrs. Pierce had been uncertain about Eliza at first, examining her over the counter with the frankness of a woman inspecting merchandise, but somewhere around the third month she had capitulated entirely and become warmly, if sometimes invasively, fond. "People are talking," Mrs. Pierce said one morning in May, wrapping Eliza's order of salt and flour with an air of supreme self-satisfaction. "About you and Cole. They say you have done something to that man that no one thought possible." "I have done nothing to him," Eliza said carefully. "He smiled at Amos last Tuesday," Mrs. Pierce said with the gravity of someone reporting a miracle. "Not just the usual, a proper smile. Amos said he nearly fell off his horse." Eliza thought about not laughing and failed. "He is not as serious as he pretends," she said. "Of course he is not," Mrs. Pierce said, "but he has been pretending for a very long time. You are the first person in a good while who has made him stop." Eliza drove home with her provisions and the warm feeling that had been growing in her chest since the garden, and she thought about a man who had built walls around himself out of practicality and steadiness and the management of a ranch, and had somehow, without either of them intending it, let her through. Summer brought heat that pressed down on the land like a flat iron and work that never stopped. Cole was up before dawn and sometimes did not come in until the stars were out, and Eliza ran the house and the kitchen and the accounts and rode Clover out to meet him sometimes in the early evenings when she could see from the window that he was coming in from the near pasture, because she had learned that he liked it, having her ride out to him, even if they only rode the last half-mile home together without speaking. One evening in July, she rode out and found him not on his way home, but sitting on a rise above the south pasture, his horse ground-tied below, looking out at the cattle grazing in the golden light. She rode up and got down and sat beside him without asking, because by July she did not need to ask. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "about how I used to sit up here alone and feel like the land was mine, but I was not particularly part of it, like I was managing it but not belonging to it. And now," she said, "now I think I belong to it," he said, "and to you, and those two things do not feel separate." The light was doing something extraordinary across the grass, turning it from green to gold to something between, and the cattle moved slowly through it like patient dark shapes, and the sky was the full enormous Texas sky that she had not known how to love at first but had learned. "I love you," she said. It was the first time either of them had said it outright. She had been thinking it for months, but the word had seemed too large to say in a small kitchen or across a supper table. Up here, with all this space around it, it fit. Cole turned to look at her, and his face was open in a way she had only seen a few times, unguarded, the steadiness all the way down to something softer beneath. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since January, since you sat on Clover and everything let go and you laughed and the world rearranged itself." "January," she said, "and you waited until July." "I am a patient man," he said. "You are an impossible man," she said, laughing. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat on the rise above the south pasture until the light failed completely, and the cattle settled and the first stars came out, and neither of them moved until they absolutely had to, and even then they moved slowly. The happiness of that summer was the kind that does not announce itself but fills up every corner of a life slowly and thoroughly, like good water into good soil. Eliza had not expected it. She had expected to be content at best. She had not expected to be happy in the way she had been happy as a girl in her father's bookshop, which was the truest happiness she knew, a happiness made of belonging somewhere. But Dustcreek had become a place she belonged. The ranch had become a place she belonged. And Cole, that large, quiet, unexpectedly tender man, had become the person around whom her days organized themselves. Not out of dependence, but out of the genuine, gravitational pull of love. She told him this once about the gravitational pull, lying beside him in the dark after a thunderstorm had swept through and left the air cool and smelling of wet earth. "Like planets," he said thoughtfully. "Something like that," she said. "I took that to mean I am a planet," he said. "You are certainly large enough," she said. He laughed and pulled her closer, and the night settled around them, cool and clean. And she thought that she had told her aunt she had not made a terrible mistake. And she had been right, but she had undersold it considerably. She had made the best decision of her life, though she had not known it was a decision so much as a desperate, half-blind leap from a disappearing ledge. She was grateful for the desperation, for the leap, for the ledge. She was grateful for all of it. In September, a difficulty arrived in the form of a man named Daniel Holt, who owned the neighboring ranch to the east and had been quietly encroaching on the boundaries of Cole's land for 2 years. A drift here, a moved fence post there, small enough that it might be oversight or might be intention. Cole had managed it with the patient legal precision he brought to everything, noting each incursion, documenting it, sending letters through the county land office. But Holt was testing something more serious now. A surveyor Cole had hired found that Holt had built a dam on the upper portion of the creek that ran through the shared boundary, diverting enough water to affect Cole's south pasture through the dry season, and that was not small. That was an attack on the ranch's livelihood. Cole came home from the surveyor's report tightly wound in a way Eliza recognized, not angry exactly, but contained, as if he was holding something under pressure. "Tell me," she said. He told her concisely and clearly the way he told her everything that mattered. She listened, and then she said, "The county land office. Is there a specific process for water rights disputes?" He looked at her. You know about water rights. I know about legal processes, she said. My father's bookshop held a great deal of law books and I was a bored and thorough reader. Tell me what you have documented. They spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table going through everything, every letter, every notation, the survey report, the dates. Eliza organized it with the same methodical precision she brought to the ranch accounts, building the case like an argument, which she supposed it was. You need a proper lawyer, she said on the second evening. Not to fight it necessarily, because fighting things is expensive and slow, but to draft the letter to Holt that makes it clear you have the documentation and the standing and the intention to pursue it all the way to the state level if necessary. Most men who test boundaries are testing for weakness. Show him there is no weakness and he will find somewhere easier to push. Cole read through the organized documents. You are very good at this, he said. I am very good at several things, she said pleasantly. He shook his head slowly, and the expression on his face was one she had begun to recognize as the one that meant he was struck by her in a way he had not anticipated. She was privately very fond of that expression. The lawyer in Abilene drafted a letter that was, by Cole's description, the most politely terrifying document he had ever read, and Holt's fence posts went back to where they belonged within 3 weeks and stayed there. Cole came home from verifying the fence line with a particular quality of lightness about him, as though something he had been carrying had been set down. Problem resolved, he said. Good, she said. Supper is almost ready. He came into the kitchen and stood behind her at the stove and put his arms around her from behind, his chin on the top of her head, which was something he had started doing and which she had decided was her favorite thing in the world. You are remarkable, he said. I am practical, she said. You thought you were getting a practical arrangement and it turns out you were. Stop, he said, because she was making a joke and he was not in the mood for jokes. She turned in the circle of his arms and looked up at him. I am also remarkable, she said. Yes, he said. You are. October again, 1 year after her arrival in Dustcreek. Cole woke her before dawn, which was not unusual, except that when she opened her eyes he was dressed and holding a lantern, and there was an expression on his face that she could not quite name. Come outside, he said. She pulled her shawl and her boots on, mostly asleep still, and followed him out into the dark yard where the air smelled of autumn cold and dry grass, and he took her hand and walked her to the rise above the barn, where the land opened up to the east. Wait, he said. She waited, his hand warm around hers in the cold, and then the horizon began to lighten, and the sky went from black to a deep luminous blue and then, in stages that seemed to her almost impossible, through every shade of pink and orange and gold, and the land caught the color and reflected it back, and the whole enormous Texas morning opened in front of them like a gift being unwrapped. I watch this sometimes, he said. On mornings when I cannot sleep. I have been watching it for years. It is extraordinary, she said. I wanted to show it to you on this particular morning, he said, because it is 1 year, and because when I watched it alone it was beautiful. And now you are here and it is something else entirely. She turned to look at him in the growing light and his face was serious and open and entirely himself, and she was full of him, full of this life, full of the year that had somehow taken a desperate, practical decision and made it into the truest thing she had ever known. You told me it would be simple, she said. Do you remember that, in the wagon on the way home, you said we could make something workable of it? I remember, he said. You were so completely wrong, she said. I know, he said. I have been wrong about it every single day and I intend to go on being wrong. She leaned up and kissed him in the sunrise, on the rise above the barn, with the year turning beneath their feet and the cattle moving in the pasture below and all of Dustcreek still sleeping around them. He held her face in both hands like something precious, and she thought that she had come here with 2 bags and a desperate practicality, and she was leaving none of that behind exactly, but she was adding to it, layering onto it, this extraordinary, impractical, ungovernable love that she had not planned for and could not manage and would not have traded for any amount of safety. Later that fall, she found she was expecting a child, and the discovery, made quietly alone in the house on a Wednesday afternoon, sent her to the porch to sit in the autumn air and breathe and feel the size of it settling over her like weather. She told Cole that evening. She waited until supper was on the table and they were both seated, and then she said simply, "We are going to have a child." The stillness that came over him was complete. She watched him put his fork down very carefully, as though he was afraid of breaking something. "Eliza," he said. "Sometime in spring, I think," she said. "Perhaps April." He was around the table in 3 steps, and she barely had time to push her chair back before he had her up and against him, both arms around her, and she could feel his chest against her cheek, his heartbeat, which was not steady at all. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Cole, you can breathe," he breathed. His arms did not loosen. "A child," he said. "A child," she said. He pulled back far enough to look at her face, searching it, and whatever he found there made something shift in his expression into something so unguarded and luminous that she felt her eyes sting. "A child," he said again, as though trying to make the word fit a shape it was too large for. "You are going to have to say something else eventually," she said. "I am very happy," he said. "I am the happiest I have ever been." "Good," she said. "Now sit down and eat your supper before it gets cold." He sat down. He ate his supper. He kept looking at her across the table in a way that was entirely impractical and extraordinarily dear, and she pretended not to notice, which she had never been very good at when it came to him. The winter of their second year together was gentler than the first, or perhaps they were simply better at it. The house had transformed in a year's worth of small changes. A curtain she had made for the kitchen window, books moved from the back bedroom to a proper shelf in the parlor, the accumulated signs of 2 lives overlapping and interweaving until you could not find the seams. Cole built a cradle in December, working in the evenings in the barn with a lamp and the tools his father had left behind. And the sound of it, the soft, deliberate sounds of a man making something for his child, was one of the sounds that became part of the texture of that winter, part of the music of that time and place. He brought it in from the barn on a Friday evening and set it in the corner of their bedroom, smooth and solid and very beautiful in the plain, functional way that the best things were beautiful. Eliza stood and looked at it for a long time. "You have hidden talents," she said. "I have been working on it for 2 months," he said. "I ruined 3 attempts before this one. Amos knows because he helped me get rid of the evidence." She laughed. "It is perfect," she said. "It is serviceable," he said. "I am not a craftsman." She went to him and put both arms around him and pressed her face against his chest. He wrapped her up, one arm around her back and one careful hand against the back of her head. "It is perfect," she said again into the warmth of him. "Everything is perfect." "Not everything," he said, and she could hear the rumble of it through his chest. "But most things, enough things." "That is exactly right," she said. The child arrived in late March, not April as she had estimated. He came fast and with considerable opinion about the process, announcing himself in the early morning when the hands were not yet in from the bunkhouse. Mrs. Pierce came, having established herself as the person to call in any ranch emergency, and she arrived with practical speed and managed the whole business with the competence of a woman who had brought a fair number of children into the world. Cole was not permitted in the room, which was standard practice, but Eliza could hear him through the wall, his measured footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of him filling and refilling the woodbox with unnecessary thoroughness. The child was born as the sun was coming up, and he was red and furious, and announced his arrival with a cry that was astonishingly loud for something so small, and Eliza held him against her and felt the entirety of herself rearrange around this new fact. Cole came in when Mrs. Pierce called him, stopping in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his face doing something complicated. "Come and meet your son," Eliza said. He crossed the room and looked down at the child in her arms, and the thing that happened on his face in that moment was the most naked, unmanaged emotion. she had ever seen on a man who prided himself on managing emotion. "He is very small," Cole said, voice slightly unsteady. "He will grow," Eliza said. Cole sat down on the edge of the bed and she shifted the baby into his arms, watching him figure out how to hold something so fragile, his large, careful hands working out the angles with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. And when he had it right and the baby stopped fussing and simply looked up at his father with the unfocused, ancient stare of the newly arrived, Cole said nothing for a very long time. "What shall we call him?" Eliza asked. "James," Cole said without hesitation. "After your father, if that is all right." She had not expected that. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose until she was sure of her voice. "That is more than all right," she said. "That is everything." James Robert Harding, named for Eliza's father and Cole's grandfather, grew into a boy who was loud and curious and absolutely certain about everything, which Eliza thought was probably inevitable given his parentage. He walked at 11 months and was trying to climb the fence posts by 13, and Cole's expression every time he turned around and found his son somewhere he was not supposed to be was a mixture of resignation and pure, helpless delight. The ranch grew through those years. Cole took on more land to the north when a neighboring family moved to California, and the herd expanded, and there were more hands and more work. But the work was good work, the kind that builds rather than merely maintains. Eliza's kitchen garden had expanded into a proper kitchen garden of impressive size, and she was selling preserves and dried herbs and honey from a hive she had convinced Cole to allow, after a discussion that had lasted 3 evenings and ended when she produced a book she had ordered from Abilene on the subject of beekeeping. "You have that look," Cole had said. "What look?" she had said. "The look that means you have already decided," he had said. "I'm a practical woman," she had said. "Of course I have already decided." They had 3 hives by the following autumn. Mrs. Pierce, who had become a genuine friend by now, told Eliza one afternoon over coffee that the transformation of the Harding Ranch was the talk of Dustcreek, said in the admiring tone of someone who was very pleased to have witnessed it. "Cole Harding used to be considered the loneliest man in the county," Mrs. Pierce said comfortably, "and the most efficient. People said you could set your watch by him and he would fix your fence and never ask a personal question." "He asks personal questions," Eliza said mildly. "He asks you personal questions," Mrs. Pierce said. "The rest of us just get efficiency." Eliza thought about this. She thought about a man who had built himself into a system, lean and functional and alone, and what it must have cost him, all those mornings looking out the kitchen window at the dark. "He is very good," she said, "when people know how to know him." "You knew how to know him," Mrs. Pierce said. "Most people did not bother." James was 3 when Eliza told Cole she was expecting again. This time he received the news with considerably more composure, though he still put his fork down very carefully. "When?" he said. "October," she said. He nodded. He picked up his fork. Then he set it down again and came around the table and kissed her very thoroughly, and she laughed against his mouth. "I thought you were composed," she said. "I am," he said. "This is me being composed." "Then I am very glad you were not composed the first time," she said. The second child was a girl, born in a blustery October that had the whole ranch battening down against early cold. She was quieter than James had been, arriving with a focused kind of attention, looking around the room from the first moment as though assessing it. They named her Clara for Cole's mother, a choice that made him very still and then very grateful. James regarded Clara for the first week with the dignified suspicion of a young man whose position in the universe had been complicated. And then on the 8th day, Eliza came into the parlor and found James sitting beside the cradle, telling Clara, in a very serious 3-year-old voice, the names and locations of all the horses, which was presumably the most important information he possessed and felt she needed immediately. Eliza went back to the kitchen and reported this to Cole, who was at the table with the accounts. He set down his pen and put his face in his hands for a moment, and made a sound that was very close to a man trying not to cry about something wonderful. "He is your son," she said. "He is absolutely your son," he said. "I am never that thorough." "You are always that thorough," she said. He looked up at her, and even after all this time, after the years and the children and the seasons, the look he gave her still had the power to slow her breathing. "I told you it would be simple," he said. It had become something between them, a shorthand, a touchstone. "You were wrong," she said. "I was catastrophically wrong," he said. "I am grateful every day." She came and sat beside him at the table, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked at the account books he had been working on, numbers marching in his careful hand across the page, the ranch written out in arithmetic. "We are doing well," she said. "We are doing very well," he said. He paused. "Because of you, the preserves and the honey and the kitchen garden, and the whole business, which would have cost 3 times as much if you had not organized it. And the cattle," she said. "Which is entirely your doing." "Our doing," he said. She picked up his hand from the table and held it between hers, and they sat like that for a while, not speaking, with the sound of James explaining the horse situation to Clara drifting in from the parlor and the late October wind against the windows. Life in Dustcreek was not without its sorrows or its complications, and Eliza had been on the frontier long enough to know that it never would be. The land did not make promises of easy times, and the weather did not care about plans. There was the drought year of 1882 that burned the pasture brown and required them to sell down the herd further than was comfortable. There was the fever season the following spring that swept through Dustcreek and took 2 of the families they knew, though it spared the ranch entirely, and she prayed on her knees every night for 2 weeks that it would continue to do so, and it did. There were the complicated feelings she carried sometimes about being a woman in a country that did not much acknowledge women as anything beyond useful, a feeling she and Mrs. Pierce and a few other women in Dustcreek discussed with considerable bluntness on the occasions they gathered. There were letters in newspapers from the East about the movements for women's rights, and she read them with a careful attention and talked about them with Cole, who listened without defensiveness and said one evening that he could not imagine the sense in a system that did not value the intelligence of people like her. "It is very easy for you to say that," she said. "It costs you nothing." "I know," he said. "That is part of the problem, that it costs the right people nothing to say it and everything to live it." She looked at him for a moment. "You are a better man than most," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "I think that is all any of us can do." There were also injustices on the land itself that weighed on her. The way the Comanche and the other peoples who had lived on this ground for generations had been pushed off it. The dispossession that was the unmarked foundation of every ranch and every town in this part of the country. She had read about it, had seen it, had talked about it with Cole in those long winter evenings when the house was warm and the dark was outside, and they could look at difficult things without flinching. Cole did not pretend it was not there. He was a man of the land, and he knew the history of the land, even the parts that were uncomfortable, and he was not a man who was in the habit of telling himself comfortable lies. "This land was not empty," she said once, looking out at the south pasture. "No," he said, "it was not." "Does that trouble you?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "The fact that it troubles me does not change what was done. I think honesty about it is the least we can manage." She appreciated that he said we. That it was a weight they both acknowledged carrying, not one he put down because it was inconvenient. James was 7, and Clara was 4 when Eliza found herself expecting again. She told Cole in the kitchen on a November morning with frost on the window and the smell of coffee between them. He set his cup down. "3rd time," he said. "3rd time," she confirmed. He stood up and put his arms around her with the ease of years, and she leaned into him the way she leaned into a warm wall. "I will build more shelves," he said. She laughed. "More shelves," she said. "That is your response." "The house needs more shelves," he said. "I have been thinking so for some time." "You are impossible," she said. "I am practical," he said, and she could feel the laughter in his chest even though he kept his face serious. This child came in May, another boy. They named him Henry. which was the name Cole had wanted for a boy since before he could say why, a name that felt like it had weight to it. Henry arrived with the focused determination of a person who had thought about the journey and decided to get it over with efficiently. And he was solid and round and almost immediately cheerful in a way that was distinct from both his serious sister and his thorough brother. James, at 7, received Henry with the authority of someone who had now been through this before and knew the drill, explaining to Clara, with maximum seriousness, that the baby would be useless for at least a year, but then would become more interesting. Eliza reported this to Cole, who was sitting on the porch steps with Henry asleep against his chest. Cole looked down at the baby, then up at her. "He sounds like you," Cole said. "He sounds like you," she said. "We have made something extraordinary," Cole said. He said it simply, not as a boast, but as the true and straightforward assessment of a fact. She sat down beside him on the porch steps, close against him, and looked at the yard and the barn and the pasture beyond, the land that had been nothing to her once and was now the ground under her life. "We have," she said. Henry grew round and cheerful and enormously interested in everything. Clara became a reader, which delighted Eliza beyond measure, and she could often be found in the corner with a book well above her stated age level, reading with the same concentrated intensity with which she had assessed the room the day she was born. James became interested in the cattle at an early age, following Cole around the south pasture with the focused attention of an apprentice, asking questions without stopping. Cole answered every question. He was patient with James in the way he had been patient with Eliza on Clover, the same precise and respectful instruction, no impatience, no dismissal. She loved him for it, watched him and James together in the pasture, and felt the love so full it was almost unbearable in the way that only the most beautiful things are. The years of the mid-1880s were good years for the ranch. The cattle market was strong and the herd was healthy, and the land cooperated more than it did not. Cole had put in a proper fence line and repaired the barn roof and built an addition to the house, 2 new rooms, one for the children now that there were 3 of them, one for the books that had grown too numerous for a single shelf. The book room was technically a library, which was what Eliza called it, and what Cole called the room where Eliza goes when she is thinking, which was accurate but slightly less dignified. She had organized it over several weekends with the same methodical care she brought to the accounts, and it had shelves floor to ceiling on 2 walls and a window facing east for the morning light, and a chair she had recovered in a green fabric that was the most impractical thing they owned and her absolute favorite possession. Cole had brought her the chair from Abilene on a trip he had taken to look at a bull, arriving home with the chair in the wagon bed, wrapped in canvas, as though it were a treasure. "You went to look at a bull," she said. "I bought a bull," he said, "and then I saw the chair." "Cole," she said. "It is the right green," he said, as if that explained everything. She looked at the chair and she looked at her husband, who had driven 12 miles home with a bull and a green armchair and an expression of complete composure as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "Help me get it inside." The green chair became the throne of the library, and many hours of her life were spent in it, reading, thinking, sometimes watching the morning light cross the floor and feeling the enormous, quiet richness of a life well made. In the summer of 1886, a newspaper from Abilene arrived at the ranch with an article about the growing movement for women's suffrage in Wyoming, where women had been voting since 1869, and the arguments being made for extending it to other territories and states. Eliza read it 3 times and then left it on the kitchen table where Cole would see it, a habit she had developed with things she wanted to discuss. He read it over his morning coffee. When she came into the kitchen, he was looking at the wall above the newspaper. 17 years, he said. Wyoming has had it for 17 years. Yes, she said. It will come to Texas, he said. Eventually, probably later than it should. Almost certainly later than it should, she said. He looked at her. Would you want to be part of it, working toward it? She considered the question seriously as it deserved. "I think I would," she said, "when the children are older, when there is more time." "We will make the time," he said. She sat down across from him. "You would support that?" "Eliza," he said, with the particular quiet emphasis he used when he wanted her to understand that he meant something absolutely. "You are the most capable person I know. The idea that your opinion on the governance of this place should count for less than mine because of a circumstance of birth is one of the more absurd things I can imagine. Of course I would support it. I would drive you to the meetings myself." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the man she had married, that first careful meeting outside the stage office, the efficient tour of the ranch, the practical arrangement. "You know," she said, "when I arrived on that stage I was prepared to have a workable life." "I know," he said. "I was not prepared for this," she said. "Neither was I," he said. "But I am extremely grateful for the miscalculation." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers the way he had that first morning in the garden, as though he was still, after all this time, slightly amazed by the fact of it. The children grew. The ranch flourished. The years moved through them the way the seasons move through the land, not slowly exactly, but with a completeness, each one becoming part of the thing rather than just passing through. James at 12 was Cole's shadow on the ranch, learning everything with the methodical thoroughness of his father and the relentless curiosity of his mother, already of use with the cattle in ways that made the hands treat him with a respect usually reserved for adults. Clara at 9 was reading everything she could get her hands on and had decided she was going to be a teacher, an ambition Eliza encouraged with every resource available, which by now included a subscription to a literary magazine sent from Abilene and twice-weekly lessons she gave herself. Henry at 5 was cheerful and loud and interested in precisely everything, including, unfortunately, the beehives which he had to be talked away from on a regular basis. One evening in the autumn of 1887, Cole came in from the far pasture to find Eliza at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand and a complicated expression on her face. "My aunt in Albany," she said. He came and sat down. "Is she well?" "She is well," Eliza said. "She is writing to say that she thinks of me often and that she hopes I have found some happiness, and that she is sorry she could not have done more when I was in need of it." Cole was quiet, reading her face. "How do you feel about that?" he said. Eliza looked at the letter. Her aunt was a woman who had meant well and been overwhelmed and made a practical decision at Eliza's expense, which was not entirely different from what Eliza herself had done when she thought about it. Different stakes, different consequences, but the same basic impulse toward managing the possible. "I feel that I would like to write back to her," she said, "and tell her that I am not only happy. I am entirely, unreasonably, ridiculously happy, which I did not expect and could not have imagined from that stage in the fall of 1879, and that perhaps the most useful things we do are sometimes the ones we do without fully understanding why." Cole was watching her with that expression. The one she had learned over 8 years was his version of completely overwhelmed and deeply contented. "Write that," he said. "She will think I have lost my mind," Eliza said. "You have not lost your mind," he said. "You are just happy." "The same thing some days," she said. She wrote the letter. Her aunt wrote back, 3 weeks later, a letter that was warmer and more personal than anything she had received from that quarter before, and they became correspondents from that point on, a relationship made possible by distance and time and the strange, indirect way that life sometimes repairs what was broken. The winter of 1887 was hard. A blizzard in January that matched the one of their first year but without the tender, enclosed quality that had made that first one a memory to keep. This one was purely brutal, killing 15 head in the far pasture and keeping the hands snowbound in the bunkhouse for 4 days. Cole went out in it when he should not have and came back half frozen, and Eliza administered the same treatment she had given that first winter with the windmill, but with considerably more feeling attached to it and considerably more forcible words about his going out in a blizzard. "You cannot manage the cattle if you are dead," she said, rubbing his hands, not gently. "I was not going to die," he said. "You were going to lose 3 fingers at minimum," she said. "I was not," he said. "Cole," she said. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "I am fine," he said. "You will be," she said, "because I am warming your hands. Next time you are going to wait out the storm in the house like a person with sense." "The cattle," he said. "The cattle," she said, "are manageable losses. You are not." He was quiet for a moment, his half-frozen hands between hers. "All right," he said. She looked up at him quickly because that had been easier than she expected. "All right," she said. "You are right," he said. "I'm not careful enough with myself because for a very long time there was no particular reason to be. There is now. There are 4 reasons, and the most important one of them is sitting across from me telling me exactly what I needed to hear." She pressed her lips together hard. She was not going to cry about this. She was not, because she had just been very stern and she did not want to undermine it. "Good," she said, her voice steady. "Remember that." He brought her hand up and held it against his face, still cold, warming by degrees. "I will remember," he said. He did remember. That was the thing about Cole. When he made up his mind, it stayed made. Spring of 1888 brought new calves, and a project that Eliza had been thinking about since her conversation with Cole about the suffrage movement. She had connected, through letters, with a group of women in Abilene who were organizing around property rights and voting rights for women in Texas. A slow and difficult work in a state that was not rushing toward such changes, but necessary work, and she had begun contributing what she could from Dustcreek. Cole drove her to Abilene for the first meeting in April, a Saturday, leaving James in charge of the ranch under Amos's watchful eye, which James received with enormous dignity. The meeting was in the parlor of a widow named Mrs. Thornton, 8 women of varying ages and considerable combined intelligence, and Eliza sat among them and felt, for the first time since Philadelphia, the particular warmth of being among women who were thinking hard about the world. Cole waited at the hotel in Reed, and when she came back to meet him for supper he looked at her face and said simply, "Good, very good," she said. "I would like to come again, monthly if possible." "We will arrange it," he said, and they did. Over the following years it became part of the rhythm of their life. The monthly trip to Abilene, the meetings, Cole's patient waiting or occasional errand running, the conversations on the long drive home when she told him everything that was said, and he listened and asked the sharp, practical questions that helped her think. It was one of the many things she loved about him, that he did not attend these things out of courtesy or tolerance, but out of genuine interest, that he thought about them, that they became part of the shared conversation of their marriage. James turned 16 in the autumn of 1892, and was by that point indispensable on the ranch, a fact that Cole acknowledged with the formal gravity appropriate to the occasion, and that James received with studied humility that fooled no one. Clara, at 13, was the most determined reader in Dustcreek, and had already begun helping with the younger children at the schoolhouse on Saturdays, confirming her trajectory toward teaching. Henry, at 10, was still entirely himself, enthusiastic and loud and kind-hearted, with a particular gift for fixing mechanical things that had surprised everyone, including him. Henry had fixed the windmill during a break when Cole was away at market, and Amos could not get it going, applying a logic to the mechanism that no one had thought of, and Eliza had stood in the yard looking at the spinning windmill with the same feeling she had had when James told Clara the names of the horses, that wonderful, unexpected pride in a person who kept becoming more than you had anticipated. She told Cole when he got home. He stood in the yard looking at the windmill. Henry fixed it. He said, in about 40 minutes, she said, while Amos watched in what I can only describe as respectful confusion. Cole shook his head slowly. "Where does he come from?" he said. "He comes from us," she said. "He is just a different arrangement of the ingredients." Cole laughed. She never got tired of his laugh. The winter of 1893 was the winter they had been together for 14 years, and on the November night that marked the anniversary, Cole came in from the cold with a package wrapped in brown paper and set it on the table with the elaborate casualness of a man who had been planning something for weeks. "What is this?" she said. "Open it," he said. Inside the brown paper was a book, a proper bound book, not a pamphlet, with a red cloth cover, and on the front cover in gold letters it said, "The Ranch at Dustcreek, an account of land and life by E.C. Harding." Eliza stared at it. "Cole," she said, "you have been writing since the beginning," he said. "The letters to your aunt, the notes for the women's group, the articles for the Abilene paper that you thought I did not know you had started writing under your initials. I had them compiled and printed." "You had them printed," she said. 30 copies, he said, "which I know is vanity and I do not care." She opened the cover. Inside, in Cole's handwriting, in the place where a dedication went, it said, "For Eliza, who arrived on a stage in a bruised sky and made something extraordinary of the whole enterprise, with 14 years of gratitude and the intention of 14 more. Your devoted miscalculation." She had to sit down. "Cole," she said, and her voice was not entirely reliable. "I did not want to be sentimental," he said, looking at the wall with great interest. "You are extremely sentimental," she said. "I have been working on it," he said. "For 14 years. It has been a significant project." She looked up at him, this man who had met her with his arms folded outside a stage office and offered her a practical arrangement, who had built a cradle and a library and a life, who drove her to Abilene for meetings and answered every question James asked and warmed Clara's cold feet on winter evenings and chased Henry away from the beehives and looked at a sunrise and thought to share it with her. "You told me the marriage would be simple," she said. "I told you a great many things in the beginning that turned out to be completely wrong," he said. "And you have spent the whole time since proving it," she said. "I have made a considerable effort," he said. "I am very glad," she said. "I am so glad." She stood up and went to him, and he held her in the kitchen in the lamplight with the ranch quiet around them and the children asleep and all those years between them, thick and warm as a quilt. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "More than the day before," he said. "Every single day." "Every single day," she said. They stood like that for a long time, not moving, not needing to. Outside, the Texas sky was doing its enormous, indifferent, magnificent thing. Stars flung across it from horizon to horizon, and the cattle moved in the dark pasture, and the windmill that Henry had fixed turned slowly in the cold wind, and the house was warm and full and entirely theirs. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow, and the children continued to grow, and the life between Cole and Eliza continued to deepen in the way that long and genuine love does, not by becoming more dramatic, but by becoming more true. It was not always easy, because nothing worth having is always easy, and the land did not care about anyone's happiness and had to be worked with regardless of weather or health or anything else. But ease had never been the point. Ease had been the promise of the first morning, the practical arrangement, the something workable, and they had both known long ago that was not what they had. What they had was better than ease. What they had was real and steady, and built out of years of choosing each other, in the mornings before the coffee was ready, and in the long summer evenings on the porch, and in the difficult conversations about injustice and loss, and what they owed the world and what the world owed them. It was built out of apple pies and library shelves and rides out to the south pasture, and sunrises watched from a rise above the barn. It was built out of the sound of a cradle being made in the barn on winter evenings, and the look on a man's face when he first held his son. James, at 23, was running the northern section of the ranch with a competence that made Cole openly proud and quietly awed, and he had started courting a young woman from a family near Abilene with the same methodical, serious attention he brought to everything, which Eliza found both familiar and very touching. She told him, one evening when he was home for supper and was being unusually careful about his shirt, that the most important quality was not method. James looked at her with his father's serious eyes. "What is the most important quality?" he said. "Paying attention," she said. "Paying real attention, not to the idea of someone, to the person." James was quiet for a moment. "Like Papa pays attention to you," he said. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like that." Clara at 20 had gone to the teacher's college in Abilene, which she had worked toward with the determination of someone who has known what they want since they were 9 years old, and she wrote long letters home that were full of everything she was learning and thinking and becoming, letters that Eliza read aloud to Cole in the evenings the way she had once read him novels. Henry at 15 was talking about engineering, a word he had encountered in a magazine and latched onto with the enthusiasm he brought to everything, the study of how mechanical things worked and how to make them work better. Cole had taken him to see the railroad works in Abilene the previous summer, and Henry had not stopped talking about it for 3 weeks, which was impressive even by Henry's standards. There was a morning in the spring of 1898, nearly 19 years after Eliza stepped off a stage in a bruised sky, when she walked out to the south pasture in the early light to find Cole already there, leaning on the fence, looking at the cattle in the grass. She came and stood beside him. He put his arm around her without looking, knowing the weight and feel of her the way he knew the weather, and she leaned into him. The land was green from the spring rains, genuinely green, the kind that only happens a few weeks a year and that she had learned to appreciate in the way you appreciate things that are rare. The cattle moved through it slowly, and the sky above was that pale, luminous blue of the early morning before it fully committed to being day. "Beautiful morning," she said. "Very beautiful," he said. He was looking at her when he said it, not at the pasture. She smiled at the view. She had stopped pretending she did not notice when he did that, somewhere around the 4th year. "What were you thinking?" she said. "Before I came." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was actually thinking and not just considering whether to speak. "I was thinking about the morning after you arrived," he said, "when I drove you from the stage to the ranch. How quiet you were and how I could not tell if you were frightened or angry or simply gathering yourself." "Gathering myself," she said, "mostly. I remember thinking," he said, "that I had done something either very wise or very foolish, and I could not yet tell which. And now," she said, he looked back at the pasture. "Now I know," he said. "The wisest thing I ever did in my life was write 2 pages to a matrimonial agency and sign my name at the bottom." She thought about those 2 pages, the hand that pressed so hard it left grooves, the plain, practical language, the young woman in Philadelphia who had read them and thought steady is enough. "I thought you were going to be boring," she said. He turned to look at her sharply and she laughed. "You did," she said. "Very steady, likely very dull, and I told myself that dull was fine, dull was safe." "And," he said, "and you have been the exact opposite of boring for 19 years, she said. "You have been the least boring person I have ever known, which is remarkable because you are also the quietest." He shook his head. He was trying not to smile and losing. "You," he said, "are the most contrary woman in Texas." "I am the most practical woman in Texas," she said, "and practically speaking, you are extraordinary." He pulled her around to face him, both hands on her face, his thumbs against her cheeks, and he looked at her the way he had looked at the sunrise that first October morning, as though she was something he needed to memorize. "I told you it would be simple," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." "I have been wrong about it every single day since," he said, "and I intend to go on being wrong." "Good," she said. "You are very good at it." He kissed her in the spring morning above the south pasture, with the cattle grazing below and the sky opening up above them and all those years between them. 19 of them, each one a country they had crossed together. And she held his face in her hands and felt the warmth of him and the size of the life they had built, and thought that she had come west with 2 bags and a desperate practicality. And the land had taken that and made something of it that she could not have conceived of in Philadelphia in any of her most hopeful imaginings. The stage that had brought her to Dustcreek had carried her to this man and this morning and these children and this grass, and she was grateful down to the deepest part of herself for every mile of it. Cole pulled back and looked at her with that full, unguarded smile, the one she had first seen in January of 1880 when she finally learned to sit a horse. "What do you want today?" he said. She thought about it. The morning was wide open around them, full of possibility and ordinary work and the good, accumulated weight of everything they had made. "I want this," she said. "Exactly this." He took her hand and they stood together above the south pasture as the light came full into the morning, and the world went on around them, full of itself and beautiful and not simple in the slightest, not for a single day, which was the best and truest thing about it. James wrote from Abilene 2 months later to say he was engaged. Clara finished her first year at the teacher's college with the highest marks in her cohort. Henry dismantled and reassembled the windmill for what was now the third time, improving it on each occasion. The ranch turned in one of its best years, the accounts balanced and more than balanced, the herd healthy, the land cooperative. And Cole and Eliza Harding, who had begun as a practical arrangement between two people who needed something from each other, went on being each other's greatest proof that the things we cannot plan for are sometimes the most necessary, that the simplest promises are the ones that expand into entire lives, and that a man who tells a woman the marriage will be simple may spend the rest of his life finding that he is wrong, and finding, every single morning, that he has never been so grateful to be wrong in all his days. The house on the Harding ranch was warm that winter, full of letters from Clara and the sound of Henry's calculations and the smell of Eliza's apple pie filling every room, and Cole sat at the kitchen table across from his wife in the lamplight and looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 20 years with the full attention of a man who has never stopped paying it. She looked up from the book she was reading and caught him at it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Everything." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had been her practical decision and her great surprise and her home. "Everything is right," she said. And it was.